This is United States History 202, Presentation 1, the New United States Reconstruction and Recreation. Now, this particular course starts with the theme of Reconstruction. And if you look in your textbook, generally Reconstruction is considered a time from 1862 to 1877. But the fact is, Reconstruction was a much longer process and lasted much longer than your textbook or even the general consensus, historical consensus, lets on. Reconstruction actually lasted into the 20th century. So I put here, maybe from 1862 to 1975 and maybe longer. In many ways, Reconstruction is an ongoing process. And it's not just the South that is the focus of Reconstruction. And most of the time, what you're going to read about Reconstruction, you're talking about the South and how the South is brought back into the Union and the South is reconstructed. But it's really the whole United States that's reconstructed. And it's not really reconstructed. That's an improper term. The process really was a recreation. And even the Republican Party at the time used that term, as we're going to see. So we're talking about the recreation of the United States. There are changes on every level of society. When I say that Reconstruction is possibly still ongoing, you're seeing that. Even in 2009, when Barack Obama was inaugurated as president, he talked about how they're going to continue remaking the United States. So in so many ways, that process of recreation and reconstruction is ongoing. When you have Southerners today talking more about the stock market than the cotton price, that's a general sign that Reconstruction has been completed in many ways. And so the Republican economic Reconstruction has been completed. But there are still other elements of Reconstruction that have lasted, or at least a long-term lasting impact on the United States beyond 1877, when Reconstruction theoretically ended. You can, in fact, look at the Gilded Age as part of Reconstruction. You can look at the Civil Rights Movement as part of Reconstruction. It was generally called that as we move forward in the course. So Reconstruction is much broader than just this small, maybe 15-year period where you're talking about during the war, and the war between the states, of course, and the end of the war. It's much broader than that. There's political implications, economic implications, social implications. So this is a big process and a big issue. So the whole Union, now what they're calling nation, was affected by Reconstruction and Republican Party policies, not just the South. So really what you get here is a changing Union from republic to empire. You go from a federal republic to a national government. And that's an important shift, because when you start talking about a national government, everyone looks at the central authority now for answers, for policy. People stop focusing as much on state and local politics. And that wasn't the design of the original Union. It was a federal republic of independent states that had delegated certain powers to the central authority, things that they could not do individually, or at least they thought that doing as a collective was better. Most importantly, common defense and commerce. And what they meant by commerce is they wanted to ensure that there was a free trade zone in the United States. Not necessarily that there was going to be an extreme regulation of commerce, which is what we see in the progressive era. So you're going to get more and more regulation. You're going to get more and more centralization. That is a general theme during this Reconstruction period. So you have economic Reconstruction. The central government will promote industry, commerce, and finance. This is Hamiltonian economics, or the American system that Henry Clay made famous. That's simply all you're talking about here. You're going to get political and governmental consolidation, the centralization of power in Washington, D.C., a loss of federalism or state power. So that's, again, another trend. You do see in the modern era, here we are in the early 21st century, you are seeing a reassertion of federalism or state power through various efforts on a variety of issues, from issues like marijuana legalization to gun control to other things. So it's not just those on the right who are pushing this agenda, it's also those on the left who are pushing a state-centered agenda to try to deal with social issues or other economic issues. There's a variety of things that are going on here. You also have an aggressive foreign policy in the spread of American liberty and democracy. So the United States is going to shift in this period to be much more aggressive when it comes to foreign policy. And the idea would be to promote American liberty and democracy abroad. So that is a definite shift, something that had never been done before. We had periods of time in American history where the United States central government had been aggressive, for example, the war with Mexico in 1846. But other than that, really in the late 19th century is when you start to see the American Empire. We'll talk about that later in the course. But this is a general trend in American history beginning after the war. And it slowly takes off, but by the late 19th century you're going to see a very aggressive United States in terms of foreign policy. This is really a progressive America. Progressivism has its roots in this particular period of time. All the reform movements, whether it's economic reform, social reform, political reform, all of those things are coming out of this particular era. So you're getting a period where you're starting to see major shifts, seismic shifts in American history. And so this is a watershed. The war is really a watershed. You have the Federal Republic, which died essentially in 1861, then replaced with a national union or a national government, a centralized government during the war, and then that will just pick up steam after the war is over. One of the things you're also going to see, one of the trends, is north over south. So the northern vision of the Union is going to dominate now that the South is out of the Union and then brought back in the way they were. So once the South is out of the Union in 1861, the North could operate the general government with little interference. They could do everything they wanted, whether it was homestead legislation, economic legislation, whether it was social legislation. The South was no longer a block to any of these things, and the South had long been an obstacle in this northern-dominated Union. So the South leaving allowed the Republican Party in general to foist their will upon the American people, and then of course when the South comes back into the Union, they simply have to accept it, hold their nose, and take their medicine. What you're going to see most importantly is a loss of the agrarian order in the United States. You're going to see more and more focus on banking, finance, commerce, industry, those type of things. So the United States becomes a very rapidly growing industrial power, and farming starts to take a back seat. There are still farmers in the United States today, but what you see is commercial agriculture, which is much different from the type of farming that people had in the United States, even into the late 19th and early 20th century. So we've even had industrialized farming now. So the agrarian order is gone in the United States. And Northern ideology is going to dominate. The South was unable to mount a lasting opposition to Reconstruction or the transformation of the United States after returning to the Union in 1865. So you're going to get the Northern view of the war, the Northern view of history. You're going to have Northern economics, Northern mythology, Northern culture, literature, art, values, all these things. If you take a modern American literature course, you're going to focus primarily on Northern authors. The Northern view of the American War for Independence, the Northern view of the war between the states, the Northern view of just about anything in American history, the settlement of the United States, for example, in the American colonies. All those things are going to dominate. The South is going to be relegated to a back seat in this entire process, even though the South really was the dominant section in the United States leading up to 1861. So what was this Republican economic agenda? Well, first and foremost, you're going to get the creation of a national bank through the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864. So just to give you a little perspective on this. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton advocated the creation of a central banking system called the First Bank of the United States. It was passed by the Congress, signed by President Washington, even though at first he was going to veto the bill because he thought it was unconstitutional. Hamilton persuaded him that it wasn't. And so we have a central banking system. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows the central government to charter a corporation, which is what the First Bank of the United States was. So it was blatantly unconstitutional. This was even discussed in the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, and then after that, in the ratifying conventions in 1788 and in 1787 and 1788, and it was rejected outright. So when Hamilton gets this is a classic violation of the Constitution, even in the founding generation. Well, the bank expires in 1811, had a 20-year charter, it expired. After the War of 1812, a second bank was rechartered in 1816. That bank was also controversial. In fact, it led to one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in the United States history, McCulloch v. Maryland. And after that point, the bank was considered as constitutional because the Supreme Court said it was. But again, there's nothing in the Constitution. The Constitution hadn't changed. The Supreme Court decided through John Marshall that the bank was going to be constitutional. So the bank then fails to be rechartered in 1836. Andrew Jackson famously vetoes the rechartering of the bank, and the bank eventually goes away in 1836. So from that point forward, there was a little upheaval in the banking industry in the United States, and then we finally had an independent treasury, which was advocated by several presidents, but it finally was put into effect during the James K. Polk administration. And so that independent treasury, we didn't have a central banking system, we had an independent treasury. That independent treasury was the basis of the American economic system up until 1863. The Republican Party had long wanted to recharter a central bank. When the South was no longer there to oppose it, the Democrats didn't have enough votes in the House and the Senate to oppose the rechartering of another national banking system. We get one in 1863. And we've had a central banking system then since then. The modern central banking system is the Federal Reserve, which was created in 1913. So this central banking system has long been a bone of contention in the United States. It hasn't always been accepted that we need a central banking system or that's the proper economic system for the United States. But again, this is the northern vision of what the United States should look like. What you're also going to see is a fusion of government and finance. And again, this is if you look at modern political economic policy, you see that the government, regardless of party, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, generally tends to side with the banking industry and Wall Street. This is a byproduct of this particular period of time. So really what you're talking about here is current events. Even though it took place 150 years ago, it's still current events. You're going to get the promotion of industry through protective tariffs. Tariff legislation was always a big issue in the United States, and generally the North wanted to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition, so they put a tariff on foreign goods. This was almost always opposed by the South because the South was an agricultural section. They didn't need protective tariffs. That hurt them, and so they generally opposed it. In fact, in Lincoln's first inaugural address in 1861, he spoke very openly about enforcing tariff legislation. Said that he would preserve the Union by keeping slavery, but he was not going to tolerate not paying tariffs. So the tariff legislation was very important. You're also going to see land grants to railroads. So the railroad companies are going to start getting massive subsidies from the federal government and through land and then through money. And so this is really the beginning of the Gilded Age. A lot of the guys that had a tremendous amount of wealth in the Gilded Age, late 19th century, made their money on railroads and through the central government. So this is basically corporate welfare. That's what we're seeing. And today the United States government generally has a welfare position, and the people that get it are primarily those at the top and those at the bottom. Corporations get a tremendous amount of welfare, and of course then you have social welfare, poor people who are going to get a lot of federal assistance. So you have a system beginning here. At this time, it was only corporations getting welfare. Those at the bottom weren't getting any, but the corporations were. So here's where you start seeing the process of the general government start handing out money and taxpayer money to various interests, special interests. And so the South had long opposed this as well. Well, now they can't block this stuff now. They're not in the Union, so you're going to get it. You're also going to get income taxes. The Republican Party was the first party to propose an income tax. And greenbacks, which promoted inflation. Greenbacks are paper money. So during the war, you're going to see the issuance of greenbacks, paper dollars, and that will be curtailed after the war is over for a time. But there are those who generally wanted to continue this practice and promote paper dollars, and generally that's what we have today. Our money is not backed by anything. At least in this particular period of time, it was theoretically backed by gold and silver. You could redeem your paper dollars for gold or silver. You can't do that anymore. So we've gone completely off a precious metal standard whatsoever, and we'll talk about this later in the course. But this is a major shift in economic policy. So you're going to see more and more central control of the economy, more and more centralization in the economy, and some policies are going to have lasting effects. Central banking system, greenbacks and inflation, corporate welfare, all these things really begin in this Republican-controlled economic period after and during the war. You're also going to see Reconstruction not only in the South but also in the West. So in the South you see a congressional policy of retribution. You have to punish the South for its sins. But not only that, there's going to be a congressional policy of retribution in the West with the American Indian tribes, particularly in Oklahoma. Many of these American Indian tribes, the Cherokee, the Creek, had supported the South during the war. And so the Union government, namely the cavalry, the army, will go out there and start punishing these people. And then, of course, they will continue the process of recreating the Union out west. by pushing the Indian tribes into reservations. We'll talk about this in another presentation, how this was actually part of Reconstruction. The railroads, as they moved west, have to go through Indian land, and of course the cavalry is going to be responsible for punishing the tribes there and pushing them out of the way, because again, this is the federal government pushing the engine of growth, and so we got to get rid of these tribes, and this was a pretty brutal process. You're also going to see, of course, a changing social order in the United States. The role of minority groups in America is going to drastically change in this period of time through federal legislation. And so really, in so many ways, the civil rights era begins here and continues on into the 20th century. So there, of course, is the South, what you would consider the South from Virginia to Texas. Those are the states that are going to be the focus early on of Reconstruction. So we'll talk a little bit about the South here and what's happening in the South in this period of time. In terms of economic destruction, the South faced a tremendous dislocation. So you can see in 1860, the per capita ranking of southern states. And per capita income is basically the amount of wealth divided by the population. So you can see in 1860, you had very wealthy states in the South, Louisiana, South Carolina, Mississippi, all very wealthy, on down to Virginia. But in 1880, 20 years later, 15 years after the war was over, you can see now the South is last in the union of per capita. So you've seen tremendous economic dislocation and destruction. The South suffered severely, and the lingering effects of this take years. The South is still in some ways recovering from this economic dislocation and destruction. It took years for the South to adjust. And so you have extreme poverty in the South. White and black Southerners are going to face very, very heavy poverty after the war is over. There's also tremendous social and physical destruction in the South. There are almost 400,000 Southerners killed and wounded during the war. 75% of white Southerners fought in the war. So 3 out of 4 white Southerners were, involved in this process. And there was perhaps as many as 90,000 black Southerners serving the Confederate Army in some capacity. Now, most of these people didn't actually fight. There were teamsters, cooks, servants, these type of things. But you did have some free blacks participating. And they did things not just serving the Confederate Army on the front. People like Horace King in Columbus, Georgia, was essentially conscripted into business. He was a free black who built bridges and had a lumber company. He was conscripted into business by the Confederacy and said, look, we need your lumber, and you're going to work for us. So Horace King actually supplied the timber to build the CSS Jackson, which is now at the Port Columbus Civil War Naval Museum in Columbus, Georgia. He also was involved in timber contracts for the Confederacy, and he sued the state of Alabama, I believe it was, after the war, for money because he wasn't paid, and he won. So I believe it was in the state of Alabama and Georgia. So we received some money from the states after the war was over because he didn't get paid for those contracts that he had, and so he wanted that money and he got it. Major cities were destroyed by the war. Atlanta, Richmond, Charleston, Columbia, South Carolina, Columbus, Georgia were all destroyed during the war, along with countless homes, businesses, farms, industries. Columbus, Georgia, and since we're here in the Chattahoochee Valley, Columbus, Georgia was fearfully destroyed during the war. In the last major battle east of the Mississippi, every major business or industry that would support the Confederacy in some way was burned or destroyed. Cotton warehouses were burned, industries were burned, ammunition dumps were blown up. So the city was set on fire after it had surrendered. This was generally the process by which the South was destroyed, particularly late in the war, by the Union Army. There was no infrastructure in the South. The railroads and bridges were destroyed. Rail lines were torn up. Rails were melted and bent so that the South couldn't use these things. Rail depots were burned. So this was a tremendous loss in the South. Confederate money and bonds, of course, were worthless. Land was heavily taxed, and slave property was lost to abolition. So people that had all their money tied up in slave property lost everything. Major trading centers were damaged or destroyed by the war. It was said, there was a joke that it was said the South is the only place in the world where people built chimneys without homes. So as homes were burned, the only thing that would survive would be the chimney. So you had this chimney sticking up out of the ground with no house attached to it. And so you'd see these endless rows of chimneys, but no houses. So this was tremendous social, physical, and economic dislocation. Many white Southerners were denied the vote or ability to hold office at some point after the war, so it was a very uncertain future. Depression marked the face of every Southerner. This was a tough, tough time for the South. And here are a couple of nice examples. The picture on the right is a picture of the chimneys where the homes were burned. The picture on the left is actually Wade Hampton's home in Columbia, South Carolina. Wade Hampton was perhaps the wealthiest man in the South. But when the war began, he served as Confederate general and later governor of the state of South Carolina. But he had a very large plantation home on the outskirts of Columbia, and it was burned by the Union Army just for fun. In fact, you can see this in many cities where in the South. I mentioned, Columbus, Georgia was burned and looted by the Union Army. Columbia, South Carolina was burned and looted after it had surrendered to the Union Army. So it didn't matter that these cities had surrendered. Charleston, South Carolina was just bombarded for no particular reason, just for fun. So Southerners are facing a tremendous amount of destruction and retribution by the Union Army. Now, early Reconstruction efforts in the South focused on Abraham Lincoln. In fact, in March of 1865, in his second inaugural address, when he was sworn in, he made the very famous part of his speech. He said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds." So he was looking, it's generally believed that if Abraham Lincoln had lived past April of 1865, Reconstruction may have taken a different course, because Lincoln was willing to allow the South to come back in and on a much more agreeable terms than what they would get when Lincoln was dead. And in fact, when Lincoln was asked, what should we do with the South? He said, let's let them up easy. Let's not punish them. These are our brothers. These are our friends. Let's let them back in the Union. Now remember, his wife was actually came from a Southern family, and there was a lot of divisiveness there between her and her family because they were supporting the Confederacy. So this issue hit home, hit right into the White House for Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln's plan was to try to let the South come back in on much more agreeable terms than they got. Now, early on, you can see this. In 1863, Lincoln issued something called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, which allowed anyone who wanted to, as long as you weren't a high-ranking Confederate government official or in the Confederate Army, it allowed you to take an oath of allegiance to the United States, and all was forgiven. And so as a byproduct of that, in 1864, Lincoln advocated something called the 10% Plan. This was a very lenient plan of Reconstruction. Essentially, if 10% of the 1860 voting electorate took the oath of allegiance to the United States, then that state could be considered back in the Union. So Lincoln is looking at resumption rather than Reconstruction. So only 10% of the 1860 voting electorate, say in the state of Alabama, would have to take an oath of allegiance to the United States, and then that state could form a government and be considered back in the Union. In fact, 3 states did this. Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee were back in the Union by 1864 because they had followed the plans of the 10% Plan, followed the provisions of the 10% Plan. So Lincoln was trying to direct Reconstruction, but he's going to have some opposition. There were those in Congress that thought this really wasn't he didn't have the authority to do this. Lincoln was acting in an unconstitutional manner by directing Reconstruction. This should have been the purview of Congress. So in 1864, Congress is going to come up with their own Reconstruction plan. It's called the Wade-Davis Bill. This was a radical reaction to Lincoln's soft approach to the South. It required an ironclad oath that the individual had never supported the Confederacy. So you couldn't have been some Confederate soldier out there fighting or giving money to the Confederacy, whatever the case may be. You couldn't do that. You had to take an ironclad oath. You'd never supported the Confederacy whatsoever at any time. Now think about that. 3 out of 4 Southerners, white Southerners, were in the Confederate Army. 75%. So that means maybe 25% of the South could say they never supported the Confederacy, but it's probably closer to about 10%, what Lincoln had actually set up in the 10% Plan. Well, when the Republicans put this thing, passed this bill, they wanted 50% of the South to take the ironclad oath before they would allow them to form a government and theoretically come back in the Union. Even though they're saying they're not really out of the Union, but they're back in the Union. This is a legal question we'll talk about in a little bit. 50%. So this is an impossible number. If 75% of white Southerners are fighting in the war, and probably another 10 to 15% are supporting the war on the home front, there's no way you're going to get 50%. Lincoln knew it, So he issued a pocket veto. According to the Constitution, the president has 10 days, excluding Sundays, to sign a bill. If he doesn't sign a bill in that time, the bill becomes law. However, if the Congress adjourns before that 10 days is up, then the bill doesn't take effect either. So this is called a pocket veto. Congress would adjourn before the 10 days is up, and so Lincoln never signed it, so it never became law. But what this is going to do is set the stage for conflict between the moderate Republicans and the radical Republicans, who are going to dominate Congress. Now, of course, in April of 1865, Lincoln's assassinated in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth, interestingly enough, for local history, has a connection to Columbus. He and his brother were both Shakespearean actors, and his brother actually acted at the Springer Opera House in Columbus, Georgia, at one point. So Booth and other conspirators. This was not just Lincoln that was attacked. William H. Seward was attacked this night. So this was a larger conspiracy to take out the central figures in the government. And this really changed the course of Reconstruction, because now what you're going to get is a battle between the executive branch and the Congress, and it's really going to intensify. Lincoln was able to deal with the radicals more effectively than his successor would be able to do, and his successor, of course, is Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, the 17th President of the United States. He's going to serve from 1865 to 1869. He's considered a war Democrat. Johnson was a Democrat. He was the only senator from the South, though, that did not go with the South when the South seceded from the Union. He didn't agree with secession. So he stays with the Union, and he's from East Tennessee. And a lot of East Tennesseans didn't want secession, and the mountainous area there of East Tennessee. And so Johnson was put on the ticket in 1864 because they wanted to persuade some of the more moderate men in the North that they weren't going to follow some kind of radical agenda should the North win the war. But the question was now, what course would he follow toward Reconstruction? Because the fact is, Johnson didn't like secession, but he was still a Southerner. And so, well, is Johnson going to punish his fellow Southerners? Is he going to take a more moderate course? What's he going to follow? Well, Johnson actually followed Lincoln's plan of Reconstruction with some more stringent modifications. But by December of 1865, he proclaimed the Union had been restored. All the former Confederate states except Texas had sent delegates to the United States Congress. So Johnson is following Lincoln's plan of Reconstruction. But he did have some more strict provisions. For example, former high-ranking Confederate officials were not allowed to receive a pardon. But for the most part, this is a very lenient policy. And the battle with Congress is really going to begin here. Johnson is going to be vilified in the Republican press. The radicals in Congress and in his own cabinet are going to start working against him to try to knock down his ideas, his designs on the government. One thing that Congress will do when these guys show up to be seated in the Congress, the Republicans in Congress refuse to seat them. And this is allowed because the Constitution says that only the Congress can determine who can sit in its body. And so they say to these guys, which included people like Alexander H. Stevens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, they say, look, you can't be in our Congress. So Congress will reject Johnson's Reconstruction plan. They will form something called the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, and they start arguing that they alone have the power to legislate for Reconstruction. And so the question becomes, what are they going to do, and who are these radicals that were going to start controlling the government? So let me go over three of these people. First was a man named Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, often called the Great Commoner. He lived from 1792 to 1868. He was a wealthy industrialist lawyer who owned several large iron foundries and made a tremendous amount of money during the war through government contracts because he supplied iron for the railroads. He was an abolitionist and a very ardent abolitionist, but his radicalism really was confined to that. Now, some of these radicals would support other reform movements and things like temperance. Thaddeus Stevens liked to drink, and he liked to cuss. And so he wasn't really the kind of guy that would be considered one of these moral reformers that was interested in not only abolition but also women's rights and temperance. There were some of the more radical members of the reformers, radical members of the Republican Party who supported these things. Stevens was not one of them. He was simply focusing on the abolition issue and could care less about the other stuff. He said that the southern states were conquered provinces. So they weren't states anymore, they became provinces. Now, this is an important distinction to make, because when we start talking about how the states were brought back into the Union, quote unquote, this idea of conquered provinces is going to play a role in that. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was also considered a radical Republican abolitionist as well. He said that secession meant reverting to territorial status. So these were no longer states, they were territories. And he had a long history of anti-Southern rhetoric. In fact, he spent time in a hospital, basically, because he was beat unconscious by a Southerner for making very derogatory statements about a Southern senator and the South in general. And so Charles Sumner was a vilified figure across the South. Nobody really liked this guy, and he was not really well liked in the North either, to be honest. But he was definitely a powerful figure in the Senate. Was a very good orator. He's the one that came up with the ironclad oath that people had to take to swear their allegiance to the United States and their loyalty to the United States. So Sumner's a pretty important guy. And then finally we have Benjamin F. Wade of Ohio. He was one of the authors of the Wade-Davis bill. Wade wanted to arm these slaves, confiscate Southern property, and execute Confederate leaders. He was one of the instrumental figures in the Johnson impeachment process. So Wade is a very important figure in this Republican-dominated Congress from the Senate to the House. So Benjamin Wade is going to try to direct Reconstruction policy as well. So this is the kind of people that the Johnson administration is dealing with in the Senate. People that are intractable, they have their own agenda, their own moral agenda, whether it's abolition or women's rights or temperance. Many of them were involved in those issues as well, and they want to punish the South. The South is irrelevant. Johnson, as a Southerner, is not going to side with that position. He didn't like secession, had no love for Confederate leaders, but these were his people. So you really see the Southern coming out in Andrew Johnson in this particular period of time. In 1866, the Congress will the Southern states will pass something called the Black Codes. These are similar to laws against free blacks in places like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. The idea was to prevent vagrancy. So essentially what happens after the war, you have a number of free slaves, and a lot of these individuals are going to test their freedom. They had never had it before, so it's purely natural to believe these people are going to go out, and they're not going to want to be tied to the same land and area that they had been in for their whole life, so they start to wander. Generally, they followed the Union Army for many years. And the Union soldiers would complain about this because they have large groups of former slaves following them around. These are people they had to feed and take care of, and they couldn't do it. So this was a real issue. So these Black Codes tried to settle this issue by saying you had to go to work. They also prohibited interracial marriage. And the other thing is they established a master-servant relationship by law. So many people in the North said that these things were an attempt to have slavery without having slavery again. And what they're going to do is allow Northern leaders to chastise the Southern-led South and led to radical Republican attacks. So these Black Codes were detrimental to the South for black Southerners, one, and number two, they were detrimental to the South because it's now a propaganda campaign against the South. Look at these evil Southerners, they're doing this, even though many northern states had the same thing, and they were called on that, but that didn't matter because they're the good North and the South is the bad South. So the Black Codes were bad whether they were in the South or whether they were in the North. That didn't matter, but this became a rhetorical issue for the Republican Party. So the Republican led Congress will pass a couple of important pieces of legislation in 1866. The first is the Freedmen's Bureau bill, which was designed to enforce the 13th Amendment. The Freedmen's Bureau set up schools for former slaves, and so you would see swarms of northern teachers coming into the South and schools being established to get former slaves the ability to have an education. But again, the idea was to get former slaves, voting. Because Northerners Republicans well knew, that if they didn't get former slaves voting in the South, they were never going to win national elections. If the South could, in some ways, keep white Southerners could keep black Southerners from voting, then the South would continue to be a block on Republican-led legislation. And that's essentially what eventually will happen. Even when black Southerners are voting, there still is, as long as white Southerners are not disfranchised, there still is a period of time where the white South will continue to try to work against this Republican-led legislation. And then you get the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This granted freedmen citizenship. allowed former slaves to own property and sue in court. The interesting thing about both of these particular bills is that Andrew Johnson is going to veto both. He says that they're unconstitutional, a violation of state powers, and he was right. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows the central government to set up schools through the Freedmen's Bureau bill. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows the central government to have civil rights legislation. They can't do it. But Congress will override both of his vetoes. And so both pieces of legislation will become law in 1867. Also during the 1866 election cycle, the Republicans will rout the Democrats and control about 75% of the seats in the Congress, which was a supermajority. So no matter what Johnson does now, whether he vetoes legislation or he doesn't, whatever the Congress passes is going to become law, because they have enough votes to override his vetoes. The South was still not represented in Congress. They were still theoretically out of the Union. So this is the beginning of what's often called congressional or military reconstruction. And we will pick up with that in the next presentation.